From Greenland's icy mountains, from India's coral strand, where Afric's sunny fountains roll down their golden sand, from many an ancient river, from many a palmy
Welcome to A Cloud of Witnesses. This is an in-depth series on the history of the Christian faith. In the next two videos, we're going to focus on Protestant mission, particularly as it occurred in the 19th century. In this video, we'll note the establishing of a number of mission societies, such as the Baptist Missionary Society, the London Missionary Society, and the Scottish Missionary Society, and will feature a number of key missionaries, such as William Carey, John Williams, and James Chalmers. An English cobbler, William Carey, is credited as the father of modern missions. In 1792, he formed a society for gospel witness in new areas around the world, and he also encouraged others to do the same. He helped stimulate this first era of modern missions, which witnessed the spread of the gospel to the coastlands of many continents. This was in contrast to what is referred to as the Second Era, which was initiated predominantly by Hudson Taylor. The Second Era focused on mission to inland areas. But before we discuss the input of William Carey, we will briefly look at Protestant and Catholic mission leading up to Carey's work. The Catholic Church had already been involved in mission activity in the 16th and the 17th centuries. Primarily, this was in the newly discovered and settled regions that had been claimed by Spain and Portugal. Areas such as Central and South America, along with parts of Asia. And this missionary thrust was led by Jesuits, but also supported by Dominicans and Franciscans. In contrast, the interest in world mission from Protestants grew more slowly. Part of the reason for this was that the early Protestant church was more focused on its survival. The importance of mission was initially discussed by Reformed evangelical Christians in Holland. Among their number was Hadrianus Saravia, who in his work on the various levels of ministers of the gospel, as they have been instituted by the Lord in the year 1590, argued that bishops have been given apostolic authority to send out Christians in evangelistic service. His pleas for commitments in this area had considerable influence upon other individuals such as Justus Hieronius and Gisbertus Voetius, as well as the Danish Hal Mission and the English Puritans, and in particular John Eliot, who was based in North America. Interestingly, Calvin's successor in Geneva, Theodore Beza, opposed Saravia. He argued that the missionary mandate of Matthew 28 had ended with the apostolic age. He thought it had been accomplished. Beza's views were widespread among the reformers. Justus Hieronius was a Dutch physician who published an exhortation to embark upon an evangelical mission among the Indians in 1618. In this work, he set out biblical foundations for missions, and his work significantly advanced mission activity. He stressed the need for Bible translation and plain biblical preaching as features of mission. Hieronius helped establish a seminary in Leyden for the training of missionaries. Hieronius then put his own ideas into action and went to the Dutch East Indies, today Indonesia, where he was to be involved in church and mission work. He arrived in 1624 at the Dutch settlement of Batavia, today known as Jakarta. And while there, he organised the Dutch East Indies Church and its order. Because there was a large Chinese population in Batavia, he prepared a Dutch Latin Chinese dictionary, and he also translated the Heidelberg Catechism into Chinese. However, after being banned by the colonial government, for a while he worked on a number of the remote islands of the Indonesian archipelago, including the island of Ambon. He also proposed that a theological college should be established for indigenous students in the region. He returned to the Netherlands in 1639, where he and others translated the Bible into Malay. Today, in the Moluccas, the Protestant church is very strong, and the denomination known as the Protestant Church of Maluku, which is part of the Reformed Church, has over 500,000 members. Gisbertus Voetius was a professor at the University of Utrecht who argued that the first goal of evangelistic endeavour was the conversion of the nations, the second, the planting of the church, and finally, the supreme goal is God's glory. Another influential figure was Johannes Hoornbeek. He also taught at Utrecht and Leiden, and he authored 4 books on missiology. He argued that the command to evangelise came from both the Old and New Testaments. He agreed with Voetius that the church's responsibility was to send out missionaries, and he outlined both the means and the methods for global evangelism. Hoornbeek envisaged a worldwide missionary network and called for universities to establish seminaries for the training of missionaries. The first Protestant missionaries were an eclectic group. They included Wenceslas Budowec, who was a Moravian from Budapest, and he became the first evangelical missionary to the Muslims. He went to Istanbul and worked there between the years 1577 to 1581. There were also Afro-American missionaries, such as John Morant. He'd been born free and had been dramatically converted after hearing the evangelist George Whitefield. In the 1770s, he spent 2 years living among the North American Indians, specifically the Cherokee, but visited other tribes as well. He wore Native American clothing. He was not part of a mission society, yet through his informal mission work, a number of Indians were converted. Morant also helped to create lasting bonds between Black and Cherokee communities. He then went to working on plantations, but as a free carpenter. And while there, he continued his informal missionary work with the slaves, who also worked on the plantations. Interestingly, some owners objected to slaves becoming Christian. He then served or was drafted into the British Navy, but went to London after he was discharged, and he ended up being introduced to Selina Hastings, the Countess of Huntingdon, who encouraged him to become a minister. He joined the ministry that the Countess was involved in, that of the Connection, and this was a form of Calvinistic Methodism. He was ordained in the Connection, and in 1785 he was supported to go as a preacher and missionary to Nova Scotia. There he worked among a community of freed black people and founded a Connection church there too. George Lisle, Prince Williams, and Sharper Morris, also all former American slaves, brought the faith to Jamaica and the Bahamas in the 18th century. At the turn of the 17th century, 2 Anglican voluntary movements began in England, Both were founded through the influence of Thomas Bray. The first was the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge, or SPCK, formed in 1698. Its stated objective was to promote and encourage the erection of charity schools in parts of England and Wales, to disperse, both at home and abroad, Bibles and tracts of religion, and in general to advance the honour of God and the good of mankind by promoting Christian knowledge, both at home and in other parts of the world, by the best methods that should offer. While the SPCK wasn't strictly a mission organisation, the second of Bray's was, and that was the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, or SPG for short, and it was formed in 1701. And it had, as part of its aim, to evangelise the non-Christian subjects of the British Crown. During the early part of the 18th century, SPG missionaries worked in the North American colonies and Canada, where their initial mission focused on slaves and the Indians. Missionaries then went to the West Indies, and by 1752, the first missionaries were being sent to Africa. The modern mission movement, influenced by Carey, received its initial impetus from Andrew Fuller. Fuller was a particular Baptist from England, that is, from a Calvinist background. In 1785, he wrote the influential tract, "The Gospel Worthy of All Acceptation." In this work, he argued that Calvinism was essentially a missionary theology. He opposed the so-called hyper-Calvinistic tendencies, which were used as an excuse for human inaction. It was his ideas that provided the theological framework undergirding Carey's work. Fuller's views on the Great Commandment from Matthew 28 verse 19, and today referred to more commonly as the Great Commission, are expressed in this comment. "And if it be a great commandment, the breach of it must be a great sin, and whosoever teaches men otherwise is a partaker of their guilt, and if they perish, will be found to have been accessory to their eternal ruin." William Carey was born on the 16th of August 1761 in the small rural village of Paulusbury in rural Northamptonshire. William was the first child born to Edmund and Elizabeth Carey, and he later had two sisters and a brother. His father Edmund initially worked as a weaver of woolen cloth. When he was about 6 years of age, his father became the Anglican parish clerk and the schoolmaster at Paulusbury. The family moved to the schoolhouse, where William was able to have his own room, which he filled with plants, insects and birds to study. In the free school, he received a good basic education, and he completed his schooling when he was only 12 years of age. From an early age, Carey demonstrated the gift of learning language, and this skill would be indispensable in his later mission work. He taught himself several different languages, including Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He was not a gifted student, and he later said, "I can plod, I can persevere in any definite pursuit." With his father's church employ, the family regularly attended St. James Church, and William became a choir boy there. His uncle Peter was a gardener at Paulusbury, and he taught William much about horticulture. His uncle had lived in Canada for some time, and after his return, he stimulated William's interest in the wider world and in travel. When he was 14, he became an apprentice to a cobbler and moved from Paulusbury to the nearby village of Piddington. It was while there that he was converted through the witness of a fellow apprentice cobbler, John Waugh. John would often debate with William over certain religious matters, and he invited him to attend the meeting house of a group of congregational dissenters in nearby Hackleton. Now aged 15, William was responsible for stealing a shilling, which was an expensive amount in those days. Plagued by guilt from this act, he actively began his own spiritual search. He began to attend the meetings at Hackleton regularly, and it was there that William found a personal faith. He eventually left the Church of England and he became an active member and one of the church leaders there. Then, in the September of 1779, he began to work for another cobbler, Thomas Auld, and when Thomas Auld died, William took over the business. Around the same time, his passion for languages continued, and he began to learn Italian, Dutch, and French, and he often read these languages while working on the shoes. In 1781, William married Dorothy, called Dolly Plackett, in the Anglican church at Piddington. He was 19 and she was a few years older than he, and she wasn't as educated as she couldn't read or write. By mid-1782, William was preaching regularly at Hackleton, and in the same year, they had a daughter named Anne who was born to them. Then in 1783, there was an important change of direction after one of his fellow cobblers took him to the Baptist chapel. He was impressed and he decided to join the Baptist congregation. Now, this was a group of Calvinist Baptists known as Particular Baptists, and they held different views to what are known as General Baptists, which were more Arminian in their leaning. In the October of 1783, William Carey was baptised by John Ryland in the River Nene at 6 a.m. in the morning. Tragedy, though, was to strike the family when in the same year of 1783 their infant daughter Anne died. And this was a tough time for the Careys, as there was little income, and they gradually sank into poverty. William also became seriously ill, and this caused him to lose his hair. Then, in the spring of 1785, William and Dorothy moved north to Malton. The village schoolmaster had left, and William wanted to use their rented cottage for teaching. So he took with him his shoemaking tools and his important, ever-increasing library of books. Next to their home was a run-down Baptist meeting house, and William was eagerly welcomed by these Baptists as they knew he was a local preacher, and they asked him to preach regularly, and it wasn't long before they asked him to become their minister. However, he failed his initial trial sermon for ordination in the August, but he continued to pastor in Malton on a trial basis. It was during his time at Malton that he read Captain Cook's journals, which talked about the exploration of the world, and he began to think about mission. He was increasingly challenged by the Great Commission, which said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel." He eagerly researched what had been done already, and he gathered together statistics regarding populations, beliefs, and characteristics of different peoples from around the world. He also made a wall map, and he began to make notes regarding both his research and his thoughts on mission. Meanwhile, the family continued to expand. In the October of 1786, their son Felix was born, and he was followed by William and then Peter, 3 sons in 3 years. During his time at Malton, he also helped to rebuild the church, both physically and spiritually. Now, while his ordination was initially rejected, He had to wait for 2 further years before he was eventually accepted. His ordination took place in the August of 1787, and in the following October, William baptised his wife, Dorothy. However, despite the income from teaching, shoemaking and pastoring, William found it increasingly difficult to provide for his growing family. So when in 1789, Harvey Lane in Leicester invited him to be their minister, he accepted the call. In the following year of 1790, a daughter was born to the Careys, and she was named Lucy. It was there that he was impacted by the writings of Jonathan Edwards and challenged by the mission work conducted by John Eliot, David Brainerd, and the Moravians. He was further influenced and supported in his mission vision by Andrew Fuller. Fuller was the minister of the Baptist church at nearby Kettering, and he'd written an important tract called The Gospel Worthy of All Expectation. Fuller argued that Calvinism was essentially a missionary theology, and he spoke against some of the so-called hyper-Calvinistic views which stressed the sovereignty of God against human effort. They were saying that trying to win others to Christ was futile. Now, while there is some dispute as to whether this was stated at one of their Baptist meetings, this sentiment expresses the hyper-Calvinistic position. When God pleases to convert the heathen, he will do it without your aid or mine. In 1792, Carey wrote a publication to encourage Christians to be involved in the Great Commission. It was titled An Inquiry into the Obligations of Christians. Carey argued that the Great Commission was not just for the apostles, but still applied to believers. He said that if Christians want to claim the comforts and promises of the New Testament, they must also accept the commands and instructions that are given there. His thorough work was divided into 5 sections. Section 1 began with his treatment of the so-called Great Commission, which is stated in Matthew 28, verses 18 to 20. As the heading suggests, he addressed and answered objections that were held at that time, that this command was only binding on the apostles.
Our Lord Jesus Christ, a little before his departure, commissioned his apostles to go and teach all nations, or as another evangelist expresses it, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. This commission was as extensive as possible, and laid them under obligation to disperse themselves into every country of the habitable globe, and preach to all the inhabitants without exception or limitation. They accordingly went forth in obedience to the command, and the power of God evidently wrought with them. Many attempts of the same kind have been made since their day, and which have been attended with various success. But the work has not been taken up or prosecuted of late years, except by a few individuals, with that zeal and perseverance with which the primitive Christians went about it. It seems as if many thought the commission was sufficiently put in execution by what the apostles and others have done, that we have enough to do to attend to the salvation of our own countrymen, and that if God intends the salvation of the heathen, he will some way or other bring them to the gospel or the gospel to them. It is thus that multitudes sit at ease, and give themselves no concern about the far greater part of their fellow sinners, who to this day are lost in ignorance and idolatry.
In section 2, Carey reviews former attempts to convert various peoples to the Christian faith, and included in this chapter is his mention of Christian missionary history, and he includes an exposition of Paul's 4 missionary journeys as recorded in the New Testament book, the Acts of the Apostles. Section 3 contains a survey of the world's countries. looking at their land size, populations, and religious preferences. He presents 23 tables of detailed statistical information, followed by a discussion of the information in those tables. In section 4, Carey offered a defence in the support of sending Christian missionaries to the peoples of the world who had not heard the Christian message. He said, "The impediments in the way of carrying the gospel among the heathen must arise, I think, from one or other of the following things: either their distance from us, their barbarous and savage manner of living, the danger of being killed by them, the difficulty of procuring the necessaries of life, or the unintelligibleness of their languages." With regard to his comment on procuring the necessaries or necessities of life, he had this to say: "It might be necessary, however, for two at least to go together, and in general I should think it best that they should be married men, and to prevent their time from being employed in procuring necessaries. Two or more other persons with their wives and families might also accompany them, who should be wholly employed in providing for them. In most countries, it would be necessary for them to cultivate a little spot of ground just for their support, which would be a resource to them whenever their supplies failed." He went on to add in some detail the skills which would be required for such assistance for this community to stick together and help each other. He talked about skills of husbandry, sowing, fishing, fowling, etc. He also importantly highlighted the character required of missionaries. The missionaries must be of great piety, prudence, courage, and forbearance, and must enter with all their hearts into the spirit of their mission. They must be willing to leave all the comforts of life behind them, and to encounter all the hardships of a torrid or frigid climate, an uncomfortable manner of living, and every other inconvenience that can attend this undertaking. Carey also emphasised the attitude they must have, and note the undergirding motive of love for the people that the missionaries should have. They must endeavour to convince them that it was their good alone which induced them to forsake their friends and all the comforts of their native country. They must be very careful not to resent injuries which may be offered to them, nor to think highly of themselves, so as to despise the poor heathens, and by those means lay a foundation for their resentment or rejection of the gospel. They must take every opportunity of doing them good, and must have an anxious desire for them. In his final section, he presented an argument in the support of Christians' duty to promote missionary efforts to peoples who had not heard the Christian message. He also went on to talk about the importance of prayer, and then discussed the formation of a supportive missionary society. Now, these missions should be denominationally based, and funding should be through financial support. And he made the point of encouraging that giving is part of us laying up treasure in heaven. He felt that the Mission Society should also carefully vet candidates. He concluded his work with these comments: "Scriptures teach us that the enjoyment of the life to come bear a near relation to that which now is, a relation similar to that of the harvest and the seed. It is true, all the reward is of mere grace, but it is nevertheless encouraging. What a treasure, what a harvest must await such characters as Paul and Eliot and Brainerd and others who have given themselves wholly to the work of the Lord. What a heaven will it be to see the many myriads of poor heathens who, by their labours, have been brought to the knowledge of God. Surely a crown of rejoicing like this is worth aspiring to. Surely it is worthwhile to lay ourselves out with all our might in promoting the cause and kingdom of Christ. Around 3 weeks after publishing his inquiry, William Carey preached a sermon in which he said these famous words: "Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God." In the October of 1792, an important gathering of particular Baptists was held at Kettering. In consequence of his work, the Particular Baptist Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, later called the Baptist Missionary Society, was formed. The society was unable to find anyone suitable for mission work, so Carey decided to go himself. It was sometime towards the end of 1792 that their daughter Lucy died, and she was only about 2 years of age. It was probably early in 1793 that William Carey made the decision to go to India, now that he had the support of the newly formed Mission Society. However, Dorothy was heavily pregnant and she refused to go, so William intended to sail on ahead without her. However, the boat was delayed, and in the May, Dorothy gave birth to their son, who was named Jabez. Then Dorothy's sister Kitty said that she would go with them to India, and so Dorothy was persuaded and she left with her husband. In 1793, William Carey, his wife Dorothy, their sons, one of whom was just a baby, together with a Dr. Thomas, sailed for India. They arrived at Calcutta in the area of Bengal, and this was in an area under control of the British East India Company. And it's interesting to note that the British East India Company was opposed to Christian mission. They would not let Carey sail on their ships or enter their territory. As a result, he had to work in secrecy, and this made his mission work even more difficult. And this, of course, runs counter to the modern view that missionaries were part of an officially organised or sanctioned cultural imperialism. There were other challenges which began right from the start. Money entrusted for their support was poorly invested, so Carey had to go out to look for work to support his family. He wanted to explore the idea of self-sufficiency, so they moved to an area called the Sundarbans. But the property they thought they could rent was actually owned by somebody else. But they were allowed to stay while they found alternative accommodation, and they eventually did. But in the meantime, Dorothy's sister Kitty married the owner of the property, and so she was going to stay. So when they moved, Dorothy was to be on her own. Finance to support his family continued to be a problem, and in order to support them, the family moved to Mudnabati, where William became a foreman of an indigo factory. He would work there for 3 months of the year. This work provided enough for their necessities, so William was able to spend the rest of his time intensively studying the Indian languages. During this time he learnt Bengali, the local language of the region, now spoken by over 240 million people, and Sanskrit, which was the classical language of India. As soon as he felt sufficiently knowledgeable in the language, it was his intention to translate. The hardships on the family continued. William caught malaria, and living at subsistence level, the pressure was often too much for Dorothy, and she wanted to return to England. Then, just after a few months of arriving at Mudnabati, Their 5-year-old son Peter suffered an attack of dysentery and died. As a result of all these challenges, Dorothy progressively became impacted by mental ill health. Then, in February of 1796, Dorothy gave birth to a son, and he was named Jonathan. In the same year, William began his work on the Bengali translation of the New Testament. Dorothy's mental health continued to deteriorate, and a particularly low point came when she attacked William with a kitchen knife. It was clear that Dorothy was losing her sanity, but rather than putting her in an institution, which William had concerns about, Dorothy was confined to a room in their home where he was to look after her. He took care of Dorothy until her death 12 years later in 1807. Carey was later accused of being more focused on his mission work to the neglect of his young family. A turning point then came 3 years later in 1799 when he moved to the Danish-controlled town of Serampore. In this area, his mission work was not opposed. He had more freedom, and there he was joined by 2 other English Baptists, William Ward and John Marshman. Their talents and support were invaluable. John's wife, Hannah Marshman, had concerns about the lack of firmness William had with his rebellious sons, and she wrote, "The good man saw and lamented the evil, but was too mild to apply an effectual remedy." The Marshmans were able to provide some stability and guidance to the boys, and in particular to the oldest son, Felix. Fruit for his labour was a long time coming, and it was 7 years before Carey saw his first convert, Krishna Pal. The possibility of persecution was a deterring factor for many, because becoming a Christian meant breaking caste, and this had serious repercussions. Carey came to realise the importance of Indigenous evangelists, and he encouraged Indians to spread the gospel themselves. He said it's only by means of native preachers we can hope for the universal spread of the gospel through this immense continent. In 1800, he began the Baptist Mission Press at Serampore, and he also founded the Serampore Botanical Gardens. Soon after, he began work on the Bengali Old Testament, along with translating parts of the Bible into Sanskrit. Carey had been concerned about the cultural practice of the burning of widows known as sati, and he began to use the printing press and the newspaper he had started to oppose it. He got support from unlikely quarters when a number of significant Hindu leaders said that the practice was not a Hindu requirement. Eventually, through their combined efforts, the British government outlawed the practice. Carey also opposed the practice of infanticide and the discriminatory caste system. Carey saw the need for Christians to unite for the purpose of working at mission. He suggested a meeting of all denominations of Christians to take place at Cape Town in 1810. And this was for the purpose of coordinating mission work. He also said there should be follow-up meetings held every 10 years. His ambitious vision was 100 years ahead of its time. A World Missionary Conference would take place, but in Edinburgh in 1910. After Dorothy died, William Carey married again, and this time it was to Charlotte Rummer, a Danish woman who'd moved to India some years earlier. The fact that their marriage took place only 5 months after Dorothy's death caused some in the mission to have concerns that this was too soon. Then in 1812, a serious setback to his work occurred. There was a disastrous fire at the mission printing plant that destroyed years of his translation work. Along with this, he suffered repeated attacks of malaria and cholera. In addition, the struggle due to lack of finances was ongoing. Carey continued his mission work but was involved in other activities as well. He was instrumental in opening the Serampore College in 1818, and part of its role was the training of national pastors. He became its principal, and he remained in that position until 1832, and this college is still operating today. In 1820, he helped found the Agricultural Society of India. After 13 years of what was a happy marriage, William Carey's second wife Charlotte died in 1821. And then in the following year, Carey, now aged 61, married for a third time to a Grace Hughes. In the same year, sadly, his son Felix died. Carey continued working in India until his death in 1834. In his 40 years of work in India, he was used by God to accomplish much. Here's a brief summary of William Carey's work and his overall influence. Now, his translation work included translating the complete Bible into 6 Asian languages and portions of it into 29 more. He translated some Hindu religious writings into English, and this was to help missionaries better understand Indian religion. He compiled dictionaries of many other languages, such as Sanskrit and Telugu. He began a number of churches, and he established 19 mission stations. He formed 100 rural schools and encouraged the education of girls. He founded Serampore College, which later became a university, and he served as professor at Fort William College in Calcutta. He began the weekly publication, The Friend of India, and this was the first Indian newspaper. He established the Horticultural Society of India. He introduced the concept of a savings bank to assist poor farmers. He introduced the idea of lending libraries. And his cultural activities initiated what has been called the Indian Renaissance. While there's much anti-mission sentiment in the West, it's significant that in India, not that long ago, the Department of Posts celebrated the life and ministry of William Carey with an issue of stamps. The Baptist Missionary Society sent missionaries to many parts of the world, such as to West Africa in 1795, Ceylon in 1812, West Indies in 1813, and Central Africa in the 1870s. And there are many, many influential missionaries, but here briefly are the stories of 2. In 1824, William Knibb, a Baptist minister, who was interestingly born in Kettering in England, went with his wife of just 1 month to be missionaries in the Caribbean. He was only 21 years of age. They arrived in Jamaica just 10 years after the first BMS missionaries had been sent there. During his time in Jamaica, he became a strong advocate for the abolition of slavery. His passionate opposition can be seen in this quote:
Upon a
The
brief
cursed
return
blast
to
of
England,
slavery has,
he
like a
passionately
pestilence,
spoke about the
withered
challenges he
almost
faced
every
while in
moral
Jamaica,
bloom.
and he helped
I know
educate
not
the British
how any
public about the
person
problems
can feel
of
a
slavery
union with such a monster.
I was
Such a
forced
child
from
of
the
hell.
den of infamy and from
I feel
a
a
gloomy
burning
prison with
hatred
my
against it,
congregation
and look
scattered,
upon it as one
many
of the
most
members of my
odious
church
monsters
murdered
that
and
ever
the multitudes
disgraced
of
the
the
earth.
faithful lashed. The iron
I came
hand of
home,
oppression,
and I shall never
daily
forget the 3
endeavours
years
to
of
keep the
struggle and
slaves
the
in
incessant
the ignorance
anxiety upon my
to
spirit
which
as
it
I
has
passed through the
reduced
length
them.
and breadth of the country, detailing
Such views
the slaves'
resulted in
wrongs.
violent opposition from the pro-slavery authorities.
It was through the efforts of Nib that led to the eventual abolition of slavery in British territories. Nib returned to Jamaica and went back to his role of pastor at the Falmouth Church. This was a position he held for the next 10 years. Nib died of fever there on the 15th of November 1845. He was aged only 42. As a testimony to his work to end slavery, his funeral attracted about 8,000 African islanders. One of those BMS missionaries who went to Africa was George Grenfell.
We're now going to have a brief look at the formation of mission societies. And as we've noted, in 1792, the Baptist Missionary Society, as it's called today, was formed. And this society was formed as a result of Carey's initiative. In turn, a number of other mission societies were established. These were largely independent of denominations, and they began as voluntary societies. It was, in a sense, the beginning of ecumenism. These societies contrasted to the earlier missionary programs where governments and churches had contributed funds. In these societies, money for mission came from Christian individuals who had a compassion and motivation for mission work. The London Missionary Society, or LMS, was founded in 1795. Initially, it was just called the Mission Society, and this very influential group had a number of famous missionaries. It was interdenominational and was begun by evangelical Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and Congregationalists. The aim of the LMS was not to send Presbyterianism, independency, episcopacy, or any other form of church government, but the glorious gospel of the blessed God to the heathen. After Cook's discoveries in the South Pacific from the years 1768 through to 1779, and then the founding of Australia in 1788, an interest in the Pacific Islands and New Guinea began. In an attempt to reach the people of the Pacific, the LMS founded a mission to the South Seas. The LMS established the South Seas Mission. In 1796, a group of 17 missionaries set sail on board the Duff to begin a mission on Tahiti, which was part of the Society Islands group, part of French Polynesia. There were ordained ministers, their wives and families, along with an assortment of tradesmen and craftsmen. They landed at Matavi Bay, only a short distance from the present-day capital of Papeete. The missionaries arrived on the 5th of March, 1797. After negotiating with the locals, some land on the island of Tahiti was given to the missionaries for the establishing of an LMS mission station. The Duff then sailed for Tonga and the Marquesas, where the remaining missionaries disembarked. 3 of the missionaries were killed on the island of Tonga during an intertribal war in 1799, and this effectively ended the Tongan mission as the remaining Tongan missionaries returned to England. The mission to Tonga was later taken up by the Wesleyan Methodist Missionary Society, which had begun in 1813. There were challenges in Tahiti too, and many returned to England because of these difficulties. One of the initial problems was the lack of supplies. The Duff had returned to England to restock, but was captured by the French on the return journey. In all, it would be 5 years before a supply ship arrived. There were other problems too, as some missionaries became distracted and lost their missionary zeal. For example, George Vasson, one of the first missionaries to Tonga, embraced the local Tongan way of life, which included getting tattooed, marrying at least 4 Tongan women, and becoming more involved in inter-tribal politics, rather than trying to convert the local population. This led to his involvement in an intertribal war on one of the islands of Tonga. While the LMS was not against interracial marriages, and in fact they thought it would be good if single missionary men married converted local women, but they were strictly against them marrying a heathen woman. In fact, they stated that anyone who did, they should no longer be considered as a missionary or a member of the church. One of those who was charged with having gone against this directive was the minister Thomas Lewis. He was accused to have sunk into a native style of living and having rejected his Christian community. And against the advice of his colleagues, he married a Tahitian wife who was not a Christian. In 1799, Lewis was found dead with the belief that he had been murdered by his wife's lover. Then there was the example of South African-based LMS missionary James Reed, who had an adulterous affair with one of his converts, and she also bore him an illegitimate son. And he was not the only missionary who was formally accused of having extramarital affairs. However, in 1812, the conversion of Pomer, the king of one of the Tahitian islands, took place. His conversion influenced many of the people on the other Society Islands, and so the native Christian community began to grow. And by 1815, the number of Bua Atua, or those that pray to God, numbered between 500 to 600. Henry Knott had travelled to Tahiti as part of the first group of missionaries from the London Missionary Society. He mastered the native language and translated the Bible into Tahitian, with the support of King Pomer II, who assisted him in the translation work. Knott's first Tahitian translation of the Gospel of Luke was printed in 1818, and a New Testament followed in 1829. Then, after working on the project for 20 years, a complete Tahitian Bible was printed in 1838. The mission work spread to the island of Ra'atia, also part of the Society Islands. The people there had strong ocean-going canoes and were fond of long voyages, and so their mission spread throughout the Pacific. In fact, much of the sharing of the good news was done by the islanders themselves, although under the direction of the white missionaries. In 1817, a newly married John Williams arrived at Tahiti with his wife. Williams was a man with little education, although he was a skilled metal worker. He was practical and he used his skills and vision to find solutions to the challenges he met. Williams built his own boat, even though he had never seen one built before. He named it the Messenger of Peace, and navigated it across hundreds of miles of open sea, establishing mission stations in other parts of the Pacific. After arriving in Tahiti, they set up home on the island of Raiatea. John and Mary Williams had 10 children in all. Williams established missions in the Samoan Islands and then in 1823 discovered Rarotonga, which is today part of the Cook Islands, and he began mission work there. He translated parts of the Bible and other books into Rarotongan. He left Polynesian ministers at several of these island outposts and established numerous churches. He was eventually able to affirm that every known island along a 3,500 kilometre line had received the gospel. In 1821, John revisited Sydney, where he preached and addressed public meetings. He was influential in the later establishment of the Aboriginal Protection Society. He returned to England and between the years 1834 to 1838 aroused enormous interest wherever he spoke. He wrote a book about his work, and the sales raised funds to carry on further mission trips. He then returned to the South Seas in a newly outfitted missionary ship. Williams and fellow missionaries Aaron Buzzacott and Charles Pittman translated the New Testament into Rarotongan, and while in England, it was printed under Williams' supervision. They'd also begun work on the Old Testament, but the manuscript was destroyed in a cyclone in 1846. But when Buzzacott returned to England, he revised the entire work, and the complete Bible in Rarotongan, which was published by the British and Foreign Bible Society, occurred in 1851. He worked on the islands of New Hebrides, today Vanuatu, where no other missionary had been before. Sadly, in 1839, when John Williams visited the island of Erromango in the New Hebrides, and accompanied by fellow missionary James Harris, they were both clubbed to death and eaten by the cannibal tribe. It was in December 2009 that descendants of John Williams travelled to Erromango to accept the apologies of the descendants of these cannibals at a ceremony of reconciliation. John Williams' life inspired numerous missionaries to go to the islands, and several mission boats were named after him. On his deathbed in 1830, the King of Samoa made this public declaration. He said, "I take all honour and glory due to kings of Samoa to the grave with me. Jesus Christ is now King of Samoa." John Williams visited the Navigators Islands, today the Samoa Islands, in 1830, and a mission was started. It was very successful and became famous for its educational work. In 1844, the Malua Theological College was established. And then in 1890, a high school for boys was founded, and 2 years later, a school for girls in 1892. By 1905, the Indigenous Church of Samoa was well organised and became effectively financially independent by the 1920s. Today, a high percentage of the population are members of churches which were founded by the LMS mission. On July the 1st, 1871, LMS missionaries established the first mission station in the Torres Strait. This was seen as a stepping stone towards the spreading of the gospel among the people of Papua. Along with the English missionaries, 8 Polynesian mission teachers and their wives accompanied them. The day of their arrival is now celebrated annually throughout the islands as the festival of the coming of the light. The mission had an institute to train local mission teachers, and by the 1880s, over 100 boys and young men from the islands throughout the Torres Strait were being accommodated and trained at the institute. Many went to serve as mission teachers on other Torres Strait islands and to Papua as well, which interestingly was the area often of their former traditional enemies. James Chalmers was born in Scotland. After marrying in October 1865, he set sail with his new wife early the following year. Their desire was to be missionaries in the Pacific, and they arrived at Rarotonga, where they stayed for the next 10 years, and it was there he received the nickname Tamate. The Cook Islands Christian Church has its origins in the LMS, and today approximately half of the people living in Rarotonga belong to this denomination. In 1877 they went to New Guinea, arriving at Port Moresby. He travelled extensively through the southern parts of New Guinea, where continual warfare and cannibalism were the norm among the tribes there. Chalmers avoided death on a number of occasions, and there were many miraculous stories of how he evaded both injury and death. One related that he literally plucked clubs and swords out of enemy hands in order to save his life and the lives of those in his party. In one region, he so influenced the natives that peace prevailed and cannibalism ceased within 5 years of his arrival. It's also thought that, largely due to the influence of missionaries, that natives were not illegally deported, and as well, illegal intoxicants and firearms and explosives were not introduced to these native communities. The famous author of Treasure Island, Robert Louis Stevenson, spent several weeks aboard a ship with Chalmers and gave this illuminating statement about him. He took me fairly by storm for the most attractive, simple, brave and interesting man in the whole Pacific. Like so many missionaries, his wife died young. It occurred while she was in Sydney recovering from a sickness, and he only found out about her death after reading of it in the paper. They'd only been married for 13 years. For the next 22 years, he dedicated himself working among the unreached tribes of New Guinea. In the 1890s, he was working in the Fly River region of New Guinea and was eventually based at Daru. Then in 1901, Chalmers and fellow missionary Oliver Tompkins were visiting Goaribari Island when they were attacked and they were clubbed to death. Then they were both beheaded and their bodies eaten.
John Philip was a Scottish Congregationalist who went to South Africa. His initial task was to investigate missions there, but then in 1822 he began work there himself. He became very concerned about the rights of the natives, and his views led to conflict with the Boers. The Boers were Dutch settlers and their descendants who had fought against the African tribes. Through the influence of Philip, he was able to persuade the government to give the natives civil liberties. Another influential LMS missionary was Robert Moffat, and Moffat was also a Scot, but he was from a congregational background. In 1816 he went to South Africa, where he translated the scriptures into a number of tribal languages. Moffat was a builder, carpenter, a smith, gardener and farmer, and he also had an influence on David Livingstone, and later his daughter married Livingstone. David Livingstone was another Scot. He had studied Latin, medicine and theology at the University of Glasgow before joining the London Missionary Society, and he went to Africa. His motivation can be seen in this entry in his journal. I place no value on anything I have or may possess, except in relation to the kingdom of Christ. If anything will advance the interests of the kingdom, it shall be given away or kept only as, by giving or keeping it, I shall most promote the glory of him to whom I owe all my hopes in time and eternity. After spending some time in Africa, he resigned his post with the LMS, believing that God had called him to explore and map the African continent, and he spent many years doing this. Livingstone was the first European to visit and describe the Victoria Falls, which is today on the border of Zambia and Zimbabwe. The town of Zanzibar is on a small island of the same name off the east coast of Africa. Today it's part of Tanzania. And it was used as a starting point by many of the European missionaries and pioneers who explored Eastern and Central Africa during the second half of the 19th century. David Livingstone used Zanzibar as a launching place for his mission, and he stayed in this house before sailing to the mainland of Africa to begin his last expedition to its centre in 1866. There is, of course, the famous story of how Livingstone went missing for some years and how the journalist Henry Stanley set off to find whether he was still alive. In 1871, after a trek of more than 1,000 kilometres, he found Livingstone and claimed to have walked up to him and said the famous phrase, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." What about Livingstone's legacy? Well, while he was in Africa, there was only one direct conversion during his 33-year ministry, but it was a significant one. It was Sechelle, who was the chief of the Kwena people of Botswana. Livingstone had taught Sechelle to read at his request, and because he was a quick learner, Sechelle translated the Bible into his own language. And Sechelle was instrumental in converting most of his tribe and also of assisting other later missionaries. In terms of his other work, Livingstone made many geographical discoveries which assisted European knowledge of the continent of Africa. He inspired abolitionists of the slave trade, explorers, as well as other missionaries.
He opened up Central Africa to missionaries who initiated education and healthcare for the Africans and trade by the African Lakes Company. He was held in some esteem by many African chiefs as well as many local people, and his work assisted relations between them and the British. Perhaps paradoxically, as a result of his work, within 50 years of his death, colonial rule was established in Africa, and white settlement was encouraged to extend further into the interior. However, Africans educated in mission schools founded by people that Livingstone inspired were later at the forefront of national independence movements in Central, Eastern and Southern Africa. Livingstone died at the village of Chitambo, which was a few miles south of Lake Zambia, on the 2nd of May 1873. He was aged 60. Two of his loyal companions, Susi and Chuma, then removed his heart and they buried it under a tree at the spot where he died. They then dried his body in the sun for 2 weeks, wrapped it in bark and cloth, and carried it all the way to Zanzibar on the coast, a distance of 1,600 kilometres. Once there, it was identified by a broken bone in the left arm, which had once been crushed in the jaws of a lion. From there, his body was returned to England, and he was buried in Westminster Abbey. There were many other significant LMS missionaries, and too many to mention, but two influential missionaries were Walter Henry Medhurst, who worked in parts of Asia and helped with a Chinese translation of the Bible, and John Mackenzie, who worked in various parts of Africa, where he advocated for the rights of the native inhabitants of those regions. Now we'll turn our attention to the LMS work in Asia. In the year 1807, LMS missions began in China. Robert Morrison, influenced by William Carey, settled in Canton, where he studied Mandarin and translated the Bible and other books into Chinese. It took him 7 years before he saw the first convert from his work. There were other LMS mission areas. For example, missionary work expanded into North America, along with areas of Eastern and Southern Europe, including Russia, Greece and Malta. And there was even an LMS mission to Jews based in London. By the 19th century, the main fields of mission activity for the LMS were China, Southeast Asia, India, the Pacific, Madagascar, Central Africa, Southern Africa, Australia, and the Caribbean, including British Guyana, now known as Guyana. The LMS disbanded in the late 1970s. The Edinburgh Mission Society, later known as the Scottish Missionary Society, and the Glasgow Missionary Society were both formed in 1796. They both later became associated societies of the London Missionary Society, and through which most Scottish missionaries would be sponsored, at least until the mid-19th century. Now we've come to the end of part 1, looking at Protestant missionaries and mission societies. In part 2, we're going to continue the journey looking at other missionary societies and influential missionaries such as Hudson Taylor, to name just one.